Okay, we'll get started. So a warm welcome to those of you who are joining us today. Thank you for making time for this speaker series on the issue of human rights. I'm welcoming you. My name is Jen Drake, and I'm a commissioner with the Dutchess County Commission on Human Rights, and I'm welcoming you on behalf of the Dutchess County, Ulster County, and Orange County Commissions. We're very pleased to have you here. We're going to ask that everyone keep themselves on mute and keep their cameras off to improve the quality for our speakers. I will just note that we are recording today's session. And I'll say that this is part 2 of a series and also part of a larger series of speaker events that we've been hosting to highlight issues around human rights. And we've covered topics including how to combat hate, health in communities of color, anti-Asian hate in particular. And this is part 2 of our series on disability rights. So we're very pleased to have our distinguished speakers with us today. I'm going to introduce my fellow commissioners from around the region, and then we will get started. So first, I'd like to introduce Tyrone Wilson, who is the Commissioner for Human Rights for Ulster County.
Thank you, Jen. Appreciate it. Yes, my name is Tyrone Wilson. I am Ulster County Human Rights Commissioner. Our mission is to show we should be fostering respect and unity all amongst Ulster County, and to be able to bring and create a community that respects and show unity and love for all. I'm so excited to be here once again with my colleagues, and I think that this series that we're about to hear is so important, so valid, and I can't wait to hear our speakers speak. That's enough for me. I'm going to introduce my other colleague from Orange County, Human Rights Commissioner Anardi Esposito.
Thank you so much, Ty, and thank you, Jen. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to part 2 of the series. My name is Einaudi Esposito. I'm the Executive Director for the Orange County Human Rights Commission, and it is a pleasure and an honor to, as always, partner with our colleagues and welcome you all to this really important conversation. The Orange County Human Rights Commission continues to be committed to bringing forward the information that's important to our community members to make sure that we talk about the difficult things and the challenges that oppressed communities are experiencing, and to also bring tools and resources to community members so that we can all be part of the solution. So as always, I'm excited to be here and thank you all for joining us. I have the honor and pleasure of introducing our first speaker. And just so everyone knows what the format looks like, we will have 3 speakers today who will share a little bit about a different topic around disability rights and the law, what works and what doesn't, and how do we close the gap. And then at the end, we have reserved 15 minutes for questions and answer from the audience. So if you have any questions at any point, please include them in the chat box and we will get to them at the end. So I'd like to introduce our first speaker, Doug Hovey. Doug is a founding Chief Executive Officer for Independent Living. He is a consumer-directed, or Independent Living is a consumer-directed cross-disability advocacy organization that serves the Hudson Valley since 1987. Doug also has the honor of serving as co-chairman of the Orange County Human Rights Commission. So Doug, I give the floor to you.
Well, great, thank you. And thank you, Einaudi and Jody and Tyrone and Jen for your leadership in your respective communities promoting human rights. And thank you for this opportunity to talk about disability as a critically important part of our human rights system, if you will. In addition to serving as a CEO for Independent Living Incorporated, I also serve as a member of the Most Integrated Setting Coordinating Council for New York State, which is charged with the responsibility of developing and implementing a state plan for Olmsted, which is what we're talking about. I'll talk a little bit more about that in just a few minutes. Last week I provided a 245-year overview in 25 minutes, right, about historical events that have taken place since the Revolutionary War related to disability supports and services. It's hard to imagine that things actually go back that far. But what I didn't talk about is during that same time in the 1800s, states throughout America began to build large-scale asylums for people with mental health conditions and other disabilities. Society just didn't know what to do with people with disabilities, right? So they put them away. Architecturally, communities were not accessible. And attitudinally, people were just not receptive to differences back then, if you can imagine. So by the early 1900s, many of these institutions became overcrowded. Everybody knows what the Willowbrook Institution is, or Letchworth Village is another good example, or right here in Orange County, the Middletown Psychiatric Center in Dutchess County. There's a psychiatric center that is really pretty much closed, right? And I think they use it for some state offices. But for all intent and purposes, most of our large developmental and psychiatric institutions are closed. We still have some more work to do. There's still some remaining. Here's a picture of a typical institution in the 1960s. One I want to mention too, I have family that live in Tupper Lake, so I get up there quite a bit to visit them, but there's a large developmental center there called Sunmount, and perfect example of an institution that really was a horrible part of our history. So institutions of the 21st century include nursing homes. I think it's important to mention that right off the bat. When we look at all of the institutional settings across the nation, the largest institutions we have today are nursing homes. In fact, in New York State, we have about 630 nursing homes, and we have about 110,000 people in nursing homes. Now, prior to the pandemic, we had closer to 125 or 130,000 people. Most of you know that we lost about 15 or 16,000 people due to COVID because they were trapped in nursing homes and couldn't get out. And I'm sure you're all familiar with the fiasco with our former Governor Cuomo and the State Department of Health, hiding data and not reporting the accurate numbers. They were only reporting the numbers of people who died in the nursing home. They didn't count all of the people who were transferred from the nursing home to a hospital setting and then died there. So that's pretty tragic. But this is a typical hallway in a nursing home, very lonely places. And then so the ADA was such a critically important part of our evolution, right? In 1990, signed into law by President George Bush. There's 4 titles to the ADA. Title I is employment and your rights as a person with a disability and your responsibilities as an employer in hiring, recruiting, and providing reasonable accommodations for people with disabilities. Title II is state and local government. That's what we're going to be talking about today, because Olmsted falls under state and local government. That's very important to note. I won't talk about titles 3 and 4 today, so I think we touched on those last week. But the ADA, Congress described the isolation and segregation of individuals with disabilities as serious and pervasive form of discrimination, which was good. That's what we were fighting for. Title II of the ADA, which bans discrimination in the provision of public services, and it says that no qualified individual with a disability shall, by reason of such disability, be excluded from participation in or be denied the benefits of a public entity's service in programs or services. So finally, the ADA describes isolation and segregation of individuals with disabilities as serious and pervasive. And that's essentially one of the main points of the ADA. So Congress instructed the Attorney General to issue regulations implementing Title II of the ADA for local governments and state and local governments. And emphasis on integration regulation, or we call it the integration mandate, which requires local governments and states to make sure that people with disabilities are included and that there are no barriers or no reasons why a person is excluded from participation in any state or local government sponsored programs. As a part of the ADA in 1990, federal regs were developed to provide enforcement. Again, the integration mandate which requires public entities to administer services and programs in the most integrated setting. And this is what led to the creation of Olmsted. And you're going to learn a little bit about how two women changed the world, two amazing women. I get chills when I think about Lois Curtis. She's the woman in the purple shirt on the right. And Elaine Wilson, another plaintiff, she's seated front and center. Sadly, Elaine passed away in 2005 after the whole Olmsted decision. And then Sue Jameson is the woman in the red. She's the attorney that litigated this case and works for the civil rights organization in Georgia. So this lawsuit is known as Olmsted v. LC, or the Olmsted decision. Now, Olmsted is Tommy Olmsted was the commissioner of health. He's the one that was sued. So you always have to name an individual in a suit like this. So let me flip here. So essentially, Lois and Elaine were asking the state of Georgia for assistance to leave an institution. And the commissioner of health denied the request. The commission and the people at the facility, there were several people who supported them and said, absolutely, you can live in the community. But for whatever reason, they kept denying them the right to live in the community. What they were asking for is to shift their Medicaid insurance funding from supporting them in the institution to the community, right? Sounds very logical, but it's a very complicated thing to do, only because Medicaid dollars support large institutions oftentimes. And when you take that money and redirect it to the community, even if it's the same dollar amount, it's taking away from the large institutions, which what we're trying to do under Olmsted. We're actually trying to reduce the census in large institutions. So here's another picture of Lois Curtis and Elaine Wilson and Sue Jameson. And this suit really has set the stage and has helped, thousands of people. So when I say two women changed the world, they really did. I mean, there's a lot of subsequent suits that have happened as a result of this particular case. So here's another picture. Lois Curtis, by the way, is an artist and she loves to draw. She's very, very active in her community. And Elaine Wilson was, and as I said, sadly, she passed away in 2005. Okay, so on May 11th, the Atlanta Legal Aid Society filed a lawsuit on behalf of Lois Curtis, challenging her confinement at a Georgia Regional Hospital in Atlanta. And this was under Title II of the ADA. In 1996, Elaine Wilson was allowed to also join the case. She came in a little later, but she was also seeking the right to return to the community from the hospital. And despite an initial judgment in their favor, and then following an unsuccessful 11th Circuit appeal by the Georgia defendants, the case was brought before the Supreme Court. So this went to the highest court in the land, right, the Supreme Court. And so the decision, they ruled that the state of Georgia discriminated against Lois and Elaine by denying them the choice to receive services outside of a residential institutional framework, essentially by making hospitalization their only pathway to needed support. The state was unnecessarily segregating them because of their disability. So the court said that people with disabilities like Lois and Elaine have the right to choose to receive treatment in an integrated setting, right? Makes sense to all of us who live in the community. Now, on December 14th, 1998, the United States Supreme Court granted certiorari in the case, which meant it agreed to hear an appeal. And then later, Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg, who everybody knows, delivered the opinion of the court, concluding that under Title II of the ADA, states are in fact required to place persons with disabilities in community settings rather than institutions. I shake my head every day thinking it's unbelievable that we have to fight to live in the community. We have to fight to get the supports that allow people with disabilities to live in the community. So the court did recognize that Congress at this time in 1999, they had a comprehensive view of the concept of discrimination advanced in the Americans with Disabilities Act. Everybody knows what the ADA is. Not too many people know what Olmsted is. I always said that Olmsted is the nucleus or the heart of the ADA. It's the actionable part of the ADA. And we really needed Olmsted. The ADA was great, set the stage, and has improved lots of things in our communities relative to architectural and attitudinal barriers. But Olmsted really took it to the next level. All right. So it stepped up the Developmentally Disabled Assistance Bill of Rights and the Rehab Act of 1973, which I talked about last week. They were two very important prior acts. The ADA both requires public entities to refrain from discrimination and specifically identifies unjustified segregation of persons with disabilities as a form of discrimination. Okay. Now, the most integrated setting law in New York State, ever since 1999, that Supreme Court ruling, the states are required to develop what's called an Olmsted plan. And New York State did develop one several years ago. First, we had to pass legislation in New York and create the most integrated setting law of 2002. And then from that was born the Most Integrated Setting Coordinating Council. I'm a member of that council. There's 9 community members from across the state. I'm one of 9 people. And then also on that council are representatives from all of the state agencies. So in 2002, we passed the Most Integrated Setting Law. And then today we have the council, and there are 4 committees that I want to talk about briefly. And the Most Integrated Setting Coordinating Council meets quarterly, and the subcommittees meet on a more regular basis to do really the work. But there's 4 committees. One is called Community Service and Supports Committee. That's the committee that I chair. And we meet on a monthly basis. And what we're doing is working between state agency representatives and local communities to try to improve the coordination of our system of care and support so that we can support people to stay in the community. They don't need to go into nursing homes and other large congregate care facilities. So we have several recommendations, several goals that are going to become part of the next evolution of the plan that we're working on, the Olmsted Implementation Plan. And one of the primary goals, number 1 actually recommendation out of the 11, is something called fair pay for home care. I don't know if you're aware, but the home care industry is in crisis right now. People that need home care services are not getting their hours filled because home care reimbursement rates are so low. You can make more money working at the local fast food restaurant. You probably have heard that, but we have hundreds of people that we work with in a home care program that we operate. And we get calls every day from people frustrated because their home care workers are not showing up. It's a very, very difficult situation that we're in today. So fair pay for home care would require that the base minimum wage for home care workers be set at 150% of the New York State minimum wage. So if the minimum wage today is $12.50, 150% would mean $18.75. We're trying to get the wages up for home care workers. So there's an interest and an ability for people to actually pay their bills, right? Something we all want to do. But there's several other goals and recommendations under the Community Services and Supports Committee. I don't have time to go through them all today, but I'd be happy to share them with anybody if they're interested. The second committee is called the Deinstitutionalization Committee, which is commissioned by New York State's Most Integrated Setting Coordinating Council. And the emphasis is on getting people out of institutions. And as we were meeting over the last year or so, we all agreed that the largest institutions today are the New York State nursing homes. And as I mentioned earlier, we've lost a lot of people as a result of COVID who were institutionalized unnecessarily in nursing facilities. There's also an employment committee, and the goal of the employment committee is to improve the collaboration amongst all of the different employment agencies. We have several. We have the Department of Labor, we have State Education, Access VR provides vocational rehabilitation services. We have the Commission for the Blind. We have the Office of Mental Health has employment services. The Office of Persons with Developmental Disabilities has employment services. So we have this patchwork quilt of all of these disability employment services and little collaboration and cooperation amongst those entities right now. So we're really trying to work hard to bring those folks together at the same table. And we've started doing this under this particular committee called the Employment Committee. And then the fourth committee is the State Plan Committee, which is ultimately charged with putting together the recommendations and from the three committees and writing up the state plan. Okay. So the MISC, as we call it, Most Integrated Setting Coordinating Council, it's the Community Services Committee is really, as I said before, it's to build synergy and collaboration among state and local government and community-based organizations. We've got a lot of wonderful organizations out there doing great work, but we're lacking collaboration and orchestration of those services and specialized services that can respond to people when they're in a long-term care crisis, if you will. And we also have to focus on assisting people in avoiding nursing homes and other institutional settings and to remain in the community. That's critical. So I just want to highlight some horrible statistics during COVID-19 and the reason why we need deinstitutionalization efforts. Institutionalized individuals were needlessly dying before COVID-19 in nursing homes due to different types of infections, respiratory, urinary tract, sepsis, decubitus ulcers, and other types of infections. The life expectancy is really compressed when you're in a nursing home. It's very different, and we know that. People tend to get very depressed and they lose interest in wanting to live, right? So we know that to be a fact. And there's also a disproportionate impact on communities of color, particularly the Black and brown communities. The previous governor and health commissioners, as I said before, they were falsifying the data. So it was very difficult. We were trying to request specific data about the numbers of death and the demographics. And it took us a long time to really get that from the Department of Health. As I said, they were only including the people who died in the nursing homes, not ones who went to the hospital. So more than 1 in 7 nursing facility residents died from COVID-19. Many of these deaths were avoidable if people were in the community instead of in a nursing facility. About 16,000 people died. Institutions, specifically nursing facilities, fueled the public health crisis, particularly in communities of color. As I said before, we're already seeing more institutional deaths from COVID-19 today. As we're speaking, people are dying in institutions. There's a higher incidence of the infection of the virus, coronavirus, in congregate care settings. There's no question about that. The courts also found that Olmstead applied to individuals living in the community who are at risk of institutionalized care. So you can't just wait till somebody's institutionalized and then grant them their rights through Olmstead. You've got to identify people who are threatened with losing their tenure in the community and make sure that they have the protection so that they don't needlessly end up in institutional settings. So that's a good thing. As Olmstead impact widens, it becomes possible to foresee a time when all Americans, including older adults and people with significant disabilities, will have the supports they need to live and thrive in the communities of their choosing. This is the ultimate goal of Olmstead and the Most Integrated Setting mandate in New York State. So just remember that Olmstead, as much as people think that the deinstitutionalization movement was just about big buildings, really, in the bigger picture, it's about the treatment of people. It's about the treatment of human beings. And no person, regardless of their disability or their age, should be in any type of an institution. We have the technology, we have the capacity, we have the ability to support people to live in the most integrated setting of their choosing. We need more housing that is accessible and affordable. We always hear the need for affordable housing. Well, I want to kind of let folks know that it's important. Anytime you say affordable, you should say accessible, because the need for accessible housing is as great as the need for affordable housing, particularly with our ever-growing aging population and disability population. So there's a tremendous need for housing supports. There's a tremendous need for home care supports and in-home supports. And there's even a greater need to orchestrate. Somebody's got to be in charge. This is one of the things when I'm at the most integrated setting coordinating council meetings, I'm pounding my fist saying, who's in charge? Who's in charge at the local level of orchestrating our system of care so that people don't fall between the cracks and end up needlessly in institutional settings. So we really have to step this up and figure this stuff out. This is all part of the restructuring of the long-term care system, which is very, very necessary. We've got a lot of work to do. So I'm gonna stop here. I hope to have opportunities to engage in some Q&A, but I wanted to make sure I stay on time. And I'm just gonna end. Last week I ended with a quote from Martin Luther King, and I'm gonna do the same today. Injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. Martin Luther King Jr. And I talked a lot about Ed Roberts last week as the pioneer of the independent living movement. And I talked about Judy Heumann as another amazing pioneer who's still active today. And she's out on the speaking circuit. She's published a few books now. But if you look at this picture, she's sort of left of center sitting there. That's Judy Heumann in the white t-shirt. This picture was taken back in the late 70s. The gentleman to the right wearing the hat is Justin Dart. We call Justin the father of the Americans with Disabilities Act, the ADA. Justin has since passed away, sadly. But there's a lot of other amazing advocates in that picture, and I don't have time to call them each out. But this picture resonates with me because I got to know many of the folks who were behind this particular protest back in the late 70s, and this was for Section 504. And then of course, this same movement grew into a movement that passed the Americans with Disabilities Act. And, and now today we use the Olmstead decision to protect people's rights, to help them live in the community. And I'll end right there for now. Thank you.
Thank you, Doug, for that. That was very good and educational. We really appreciate that. Moving right along, I have the opportunity to present our next speaker, Anthony Mayone, Chief Executive Officer of Resource Center for Accessible Living in the Ulster County Independent Living since 1983. So Anthony, you have the floor, and thank you for being here with us.
Thank you. Good afternoon. I am a large, white, balding man. I'm sitting in my office with a bookcase behind me, and I am wearing a cardigan with a blue shirt and no tie today. I got lazy. So I did want to just thank again everybody for being here, and I'm supposed to speak about the barriers that individuals with disabilities experience every day in the community and on this planet. And I wanted to just tag on to what Mr. Doug Hovey was speaking about and let you know that I personally am on the Ulster County Workforce Development Board. I am an advisor to the Ulster County Transportation Council, and I am the chair of the Ulster County Council for the Aging, which is the oversight board for the Office of the Aging. And the reason why I am involved in all those things, and Doug is on all the committees that he is on, and Lisa as well, is that we are all part of the Independent Living Network. And living independently and removing barriers requires us to be involved in all of these committees in every facet of government and community to make sure that people become more and more aware of what is happening, because barriers come from lack of knowledge. Barriers come from the lack of understanding. So that's going to resonate throughout everything else that I say today. And I'm going to end by showing a video by Stella Young, who humorously talks about why we as citizens have the failings that we do when it comes to disability. Okay. So Let's start with lack of employment due to assumptions. So Doug has already touched on some of the pieces of employment that we don't have the funding to get the reimbursement rates and pay the salaries, and therefore people do not want to take the jobs that are necessary to help individuals stay in the community. However, he didn't talk about individuals with disabilities who would like to be employed and work in the community, which all of us on this call who are from an independent living center are individuals with disabilities, and we are all employed, and it is possible. Personally, in my career, I have not only surprised my others, but I have also surprised myself sometimes with the things that I am capable of doing. And the interpretation and the sense of what other people can do is a judgment that people who hire individuals to work make all the time. And that is something that is not appropriate. It is something that creates barriers to employment when assumptions are made of what your limitations are. You should never put limitations on other individuals. Everybody should have the right to strive and try to do whatever it is that they know they are capable of. And you'll notice I said they are capable of. You know what you're capable of, and if you don't, trying and failing and learning is a part of the process. And one of the things that I believe heavily in is the right to fail. We, as individuals with disabilities, people in general, have the right to try and fail. That is a part of something that everybody gets to do, and that will help everybody to have an understanding of individuals with disabilities trying to be in the employment field. Another big barrier that we have as a whole in our community is the lack of enforcement. Doug has spent a lot of time both this week and last week talking about the history of individuals with disabilities, the ADA Act, and how all the wonderful things that it can do and doesn't do. And part of the reason that it doesn't help as much as it could is because it's a law with no teeth, meaning there's no bite. There's very little repercussion as far as if you don't do what you're supposed to do. It's based not on penalization. It's based on everybody doing what they're supposed to do because they're supposed to do it. And that's wonderful if it works. But as we all know, that does not always work. It is on the burden of a person with a disability to report anything that they feel is unfair, unsafe, unethical, or mistreatment, or unequal access to a building, for employment, for anything. There is nobody who is out there policing, so to speak, the actual Americans with Disability Act. They have to actually have a report, and then somebody may come out and investigate. My experience personally, you receive a letter. They send the corporation a letter, and they tell them to do better, and then they wait and see what happens. So that is not always useful, and that is a barrier. Stella Young says, no amount of smiling at a flight of stairs will turn it into a ramp. And that is a very true statement, in that we need to make sure that we do what we're supposed to be doing, but we also need to do something legislatively that requires a body, a local enforcement body. For a very little while there, the Division of Human Rights had a grant funding down in the Bronx to even come up into the Hudson Valley area and do some site visits to the county and state buildings. And then if they were out of compliance and they refused to go into compliance, they actually brought a couple of suits locally against some of the facilities, and they branched out into some of the commercial residential facilities. It was nice to see that some of that happened, and it did force some change and some removal of some barriers, but that's not the norm. So another barrier that individuals face every day, which again Doug spoke about, is the lack of housing, accessible and affordable. Affordable housing, accessible housing. They have passed some new legislation on both a state and national level that allows individuals to have a better chance of having an accessible home, because new construction is required to have first floor entry. If you're getting HUD funding, you're required to have a certain amount of accessible units, but it's not enough. And the lack of the funding for low-income housing is not only one piece of the problem. Even if there does happen to be funding, getting the necessary permits to actually build the affordable housing and jumping through all of the hoops and all of the red tape that they have put in place is a process that is just so arduous that it slows everything down. Affordable housing and approval today for something that is 10 years away or 8 years away is not going to help us today get an individual out of an institution or off the streets into an affordable home. And that is true regardless of if you have a disability or not. In our local area, we are currently at a moment here in Ulster County where the Section 8 vouchers waiting list is open. So you now have the ability of actually putting in an application and getting on the waiting list to get affordable housing vouchers to assist you. 2 months ago, you couldn't even get on the waiting list. The waiting list is years. So the thrill at the moment is that you have the ability of putting in a piece of paper that will allow you to get on a list so that maybe in a year or 2 or 3, you might be able to get some assistance. And this is progress. Progress. It's amazing what we consider progress sometimes. We are always trying to make things better for the future. Occasionally, we need to stop and make some things better for the now. Lack of capacity is another barrier. So Doug spoke again about individuals who are in their homes who need staff, and that staff not being paid adequately. It's multi-level. We have to be aware of, and we need to approach our legislators to work on things from several angles. Yes, it would be lovely if we could get 150% of minimum wage paid to our healthcare workers. And there are other workers like community rehabilitation specialists, direct service providers that provide respite care. But not only do you have to want to pay them more money, you have to have the funding to pay them more money. And the simple fact of the matter is, if the reimbursement rate from the state for these services is not high enough to commiserate paying those wages, then you cannot pay those wages. So we have to have more than the desire. I would love to pay every single member of the Independent Living Center here in Kingston more money than I am paying them now. There is nobody here that is not worth more money than they are receiving. But we need to work with our legislators and get our funding increased in order for us to be able to do those things. So that is a very strong barrier. And all of these barriers, and I know Lisa is going to touch on this, I believe, later, are things that we need to get together and work on together to bring attention to the legislators so that they know that we care about these things. Because group in power is going to help us make change. If we work together, we can make them know what we need and what we're concerned about, and that's what we're going to be voting on those issues. All right. So with that said, there are additional barriers that we need to talk about, and one of those is perception. People's perception of individuals with disabilities is not necessarily real. It's something that we have been taught by our society without even realizing it. And it needs to be changed in a very valid way. So let me introduce you to somebody who I was introduced to a long time ago, and her name is Stella Young. And she, if I can find my share my screen button, she is an absolutely fantastic individual who talks about how disability is perceived in society and things that we should and should not believe in. So just hold on one moment.
I grew up in a very small country town in Victoria. I had a very normal, low-key kind of upbringing. I went to school, I hung out with my friends, I fought with my younger sisters. It's all very normal. And when I was 15, a member of my local community approached my parents and wanted to nominate me for a Community Achievement Award. And my parents said, that's really nice, but there's kind of one glaring problem with that. She hasn't actually achieved anything. Yeah, and they were right. I went to school, I got good marks, I had a very low-key after-school job in my mum's hairdressing salon, and I spent a lot of time watching Buffy the Vampire Slayer and Dawson's Creek. Yeah, I know, what a contradiction. But they were right. I wasn't doing anything that was out of the ordinary at all. I wasn't doing anything that could be considered an achievement if you took disability out of the equation. Years later, I was on my second teaching round in a Melbourne high school, and I was about 20 minutes into a year 11 legal studies class when this boy put up his hand and said, "Hey, miss, when are you going to start doing your speech?" And I said, "What speech?" I'd been talking to them about defamation law for a good 20 minutes. And he said, like your motivational speaking. When people in wheelchairs come to school, they usually say like inspirational stuff. It's usually in the big hall. And that's when it dawned on me. This kid had only ever experienced disabled people as objects of inspiration. We are not, to this kid, and it's not his fault. I mean, that's true for many of us. For lots of us, disabled people are not our teachers or our doctors or our manicurists. We're not real people. We are there to inspire. And in fact, I'm sitting on this stage looking like I do in this wheelchair, and you are probably kind of expecting me to inspire you, right? Yeah. Well, ladies and gentlemen, I'm afraid I'm going to disappoint you dramatically. I'm not here to inspire you. I'm here to tell you that we have been lied to about disability. Yeah, we've been sold the lie that disability is a bad thing. Capital B, capital T. It's a bad thing. And to live with disability makes you exceptional. It's not a bad thing, and it doesn't make you exceptional. And in the past few years, we've been able to propagate this lie even further via social media. You may have seen images like this one. The only disability in life is a bad attitude. Or this one, your excuse is invalid, indeed. Or this one, before you quit, try. Yeah. These are just a couple of examples, but there are a lot of these images out there. You might have seen the little girl with no hands drawing a picture with a pencil held in her mouth. You might have seen a child running on carbon fiber prosthetic legs. And these images, there are lots of them out there. They are what we call inspiration porn. And I use the term porn deliberately because they objectify one group of people for the benefit of another group of people. So in this case, we're objectifying disabled people for the benefit of non-disabled people. The purpose of these images is to inspire you, to motivate you, so that we can look at them and think, well, however bad my life is, it could be worse.
Anthony, are you still with us? I think your screen.
It is objectifying. These images objectify disabled people for the benefit of non-disabled people. You know, they are there so that you can look at them and think that things aren't so bad for you, to put your worries into perspective. And life as a disabled person is actually somewhat difficult. We do overcome some things, but the things that we're overcoming are not the things that you think they are. They are not things to do with our bodies. I use the term disabled people quite deliberately because I subscribe to what's called the social model of disability, which tells us that we are more disabled by our bodies, the society that we live in rather, than by our bodies and our diagnosis. So I've lived in this body a long time. I'm quite fond of it. It does the things that I need it to do, and I've learnt to use it to the best of its capacity, just as you have. And that's the thing about those kids in those pictures as well. They're not doing anything out of the ordinary. They are just using their bodies to the best of their capacity. So is it really fair to objectify them in the way that we do, to share those images? People, when they say, you know, you're an inspiration, they mean it as a compliment. They mean it as a compliment. And I know why it happens. It's because of the lie. It's because we've been sold this lie that disability makes you exceptional. And it honestly doesn't. And I know what you're thinking. You know, I'm up here bagging out inspiration. You're thinking, geez, Stella, aren't you inspired sometimes by some things? And the thing is, I am. I learn from other disabled people all the time. I'm learning not that I am luckier than them, though. I am learning that it's a genius idea to use a pair of barbecue tongs to pick up things that you drop. I'm learning that nifty trick where you can charge your mobile phone battery from your chair battery. Genius. We are learning from each other strength and endurance, not against our bodies and our diagnosis, but against a world that exceptionalizes and objectifies us. I really think that this lie that we've been sold about disability is the greatest injustice. It makes life hard for us. And that quote, "the only disability in life is a bad attitude," the reason that that's bullshit is because it's just not true. Because of the social model of disability, you know, no amount of smiling at a flight of stairs has ever made it turn into a rap. Never. You know, smiling at a television screen isn't going to make closed captions appear for people who are deaf. You know, no amount of standing in the middle of a bookshop and radiating a positive attitude is going to turn all those books into Braille. It's just not going to happen. It's just not going to happen. I really want to live in a world where disability is not the exception, but the norm. I want to live in a world where a 15-year-old girl sitting in her bedroom watching Buffy the Vampire Slayer isn't referred to as achieving anything because she's doing it sitting down. I want to live in a world where we don't have such low expectations of disabled people that we are congratulated for getting out of bed and remembering our own names in the morning. I want to live in a world where we value genuine achievement for disabled people. And I want to live in a world where a kid in year 11 in a Melbourne high school is not one bit surprised that his new teacher is a wheelchair user. Disability doesn't make you exceptional, but questioning what you think you know about it does. Thank you.
So that is what we're talking about, removing barriers so that Stella's dream can come true, removing barriers by working together and not just thinking about it. And that's all for me today. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Anthony, for those powerful thoughts and sharing that really fantastic TED Talk. So I'm very happy to introduce our third speaker, who is Lisa Tarracone. Lisa is a seasoned disability rights advocate with over 25 years of professional experience working within the independent living movement in New York State. She is currently employed as the executive director of Taconic Resources for Independence here in Dutchess County, where she works to promote full community inclusivity and freedom of choice for people with disabilities. Thank you, Lisa.
Thank you, Jen, for that introduction. And thank you, everyone, Tyrone, Jen, Jody, Nadi, for hosting this, this informational webinar on disability rights, which is something that we really need. It's an underreported issue in our mainstream publications. It's not enough public discourse around it, so I really appreciate this. As Jen mentioned, I'm Lisa Tarracone, Executive Director of Taconic Resources for Independence. And as Anthony mentioned and Doug, we are part of, our centers are part of an independent living network of 41 centers across the state of New York. And I think over 500 nationwide that promote the independent living philosophy, which is to ensure the full integration of persons with disabilities in all aspects of our society. So I'm going to bring up a PowerPoint right now to try to tie everything together. There's a lot of information in it, so I'm going to try to get to it rather quickly, and I'm going to stress certain aspects that I think are important and maybe just touch on others. So let me bring this up and try to do this effectively here. Still learning to navigate. Apologize. Share. Here we go. Where's the screen? Here we go. Okay. So systems advocacy to actively promote the full integration of persons with disabilities in the community so as to achieve equal access, equality of opportunity, individual choice, and the removal of attitudinal barriers. You know, Anthony spoke a lot about attitudinal barriers, and I did last session with the video I showed. I think attitudinal barriers are really the major barriers that drive every other instance of discrimination in our culture. So it's really important to really have discussion around that. So some strategies for systems advocacy. Basically, it's about education, educating the community, legislators, consumers, people with disabilities themselves about their rights. And these are examples of systems advocacy strategies that I've done throughout my career, and that we all do as advocates in the IL movement. Educating and training peers and volunteer advocates and action alerts. Action alerts are basically they're like email blasts, sending out faxes to public officials around an issue to educate them. We communicate, build community task force to do site surveys of businesses, empowerment workshops for consumers, as I mentioned, and disseminating information around legislative priorities, important issues of legislation that are current. Building coalitions of community leaders, grassroots groups, and experts. That's really important to really have power in numbers. I'll talk a little bit more about that later in my presentation. Engage in direct advocacy with businesses to address barriers that block inclusion of people with disabilities. You know, the ADA was passed, was signed into law over 35 years ago, and we still have rampant Title III noncompliance. Title III is the ensuring that places of public accommodation are accessible to people with disabilities. So we do a lot of direct advocacy to try to educate businesses about removing these barriers, removing ramps, creating alternative formats for people so they can access services. More examples of citizens advocacy: creating campaigns to educate political and civic leaders, legislative forum testimonies, and working with municipal agencies. A lot of these campaigns, Doug mentioned one earlier, Caring Majority is a very robust campaign right now that's addressing the fair pay for home care workers. You know, these are workers that personal care attendants that get paid well below minimum wage, and they're doing an amazing amount of, work, care for people with disabilities, and there's a shortage. It's a crisis. And a lot of our folks are institutionalized because they just can't find attendant care. So that's, I think the Caring Majority campaign is really important. There's another one called Not Dead Yet, and that campaign raises awareness about the physician-assisted suicide issue, which is a very hot button issue in our community. There's an aid in dying bill, and I think that there's I've done a lot of advocacy around this one. You know, and there's a lot of misinterpretation around it. Yes, it's, we advocate for choice in the independent living movement, and a lot of the pushback that advocates have received around the aid in dying bill is that people should have a choice if they are in intractable pain and they're terminal to end their lives. And we're not talking about that specifically. What we're talking about is the slippery slope in the legislation. Physician-assisted suicide, when you talk about attitudinal discrimination, I think is really speaks to that. There's a devaluing of a lot of the language, a lot of the assumptions that are made about what constitutes a terminal illness, what constitutes a life worth not living. Not worth living is, as Stella said in the TED Talk, is that disability is something exceptional. It's reviewed as the other. It's a bad thing. So, people, Jack Kevorkian, I think there were, I don't remember, I think over 70 people that he assisted in dying, the majority of whom had disabilities, because either they perceived their lives were not worth living, or they just couldn't get the medical help that they needed. So, so the physician-assisted suicide legislation, aid in dying, really promotes and enhances that messaging, that stereotyping that people's lives, people with disabilities, their lives are not worth living. So that's, Not Dead Yet is doing a lot of important work around that. Liaison to reporters, I'm going to talk more about that in the next slide. I think media representation is crucial to getting your message out, to changing attitudinal discrimination, to driving public policy, to raising public awareness, to create and embolden legislation and protect the ADA. Civil disobedience, very important. I participated in a lot of civil disobedience activity. A lot of my colleagues have, Doug and Anthony and my staff. And this is, nonviolent activity to raise awareness, taking over the war room at the Capitol, shutting down the Corning Tower in Albany when we didn't get over Medicaid reform. It gets the attention of the media, it gets the attention of the public, and gets the attention of legislators that, we mean business. We're a force to be reckoned with. ADAPT is a very robust group. I think there's 30 chapters nationwide, and ADAPT stands for American Disabled for Attendant Programs Today. They do a lot of activity around promoting community-based services for people with disabilities. They do sit in Washington, throughout the various states. I've worked with them in Albany. So they're a very well organized and recognized group, and they've done a lot of important work around community-based supports and long-term care. So as I mentioned in the last slide, I think strategies for cultivating media coverage is so important to really driving our issues home, to getting the attention of legislators, to shining a light on what's not being done, and to hold public leaders accountable. There is a photograph here on the right, and the photograph is a press conference. I'm going to describe it. It's basically work I've done with Assemblywoman Sandy Galiff over the the new signage in New York State, and I think there's other, I think 12 other states nationwide that have a new disability empowerment icon. So typically, you know, the icon that we're all familiar with, the wheelchair, the blue wheelchair symbol that depicts blue spot parking and disabled services that you'll see on buildings, is a static symbol of somebody sitting in a wheelchair. It's not very, it doesn't represent, doesn't represent the empowerment and the robust, tenor of the community. So I worked with Sandy Galiff, Assemblyman Galiff, and Senator Carlucci to incorporate legislation to change the imaging in New York State to include the disability icon as an empowerment symbol. And this is a photograph of a press conference that we did around that. So that's the photo I wanted to describe. But some strategies for cultivating media coverage, establishing relationships with key news staff, getting to know your local reporters, follow their beats, pitch stories to them, connect stories to major stories to disability. How does housing affect people with disabilities, right? Talk about the accessible housing shortage, the crisis for people with disabilities and the lack of accessible and affordable housing. Have photos and quotes ready for reporters. Be a source to them, a go-to source to them. I've been called many times to provide commentary about issues of impact, current issues of impact, because I email them, I Twitter them frequently, so they know me. So get to know your local media markets and reporters. Correct reporters in disability language. When I've been interviewed and I read stories in newspapers, they'll use the word handicapped. They don't use the word crippled anymore, but sometimes they do. But the word handicapped, bound to a wheelchair, that's a very negative image. Someone bound to a wheelchair. It's like Stella said, it's a bad thing. We're not bound to our wheelchairs. I'm a wheelchair user. It's something I use to get around. I use a wheelchair for mobility. I'm not bound to it. So the word handicapped, again, it denotes a disadvantage, something negative. So when I'm quoted for an article, I usually ask to read the article first so that I'm not misrepresented or misquoted. So there's language, and there's also the way reporters like to sensationalize a story. This poor disabled woman can't get into a restaurant, which is how an article was written about me once. I'm not a poor disabled woman. I retracted that story. I'd rather not get the coverage than have myself portrayed, or anybody with a disability, as poor and as something to be pitied. So that needs to be checked. And the media is, they're getting it right better and better, but they need to really to really hold them accountable to that. And then working with local officials, as I mentioned earlier, when I described the photograph rather, press conferences, I submit press releases around issues, try to, participate in opportunities for photos, testimonials, participating in public hearings, city council meetings, public forums, very, very important, in the local, state, and federal levels. Let me see next slide here. So some issues, some current issues that we're working on statewide. We mentioned that, Taconic Resources for Independence and RCAL and Doug Center, My Independent Living. We're all part of the Independent Living Network in the state. And we have our Disability Priority Agenda, which comes out once a year. There's a lot of issues. These are just a few of the many issues we're working on. There are so many issues, advocacy issues that need attention. But these are the ones that we work on and target as priorities across the state. And then we work with our staff, we work with our public officials, and we work with the public and our community members to address some of these issues. And election reform is an ongoing one. We have made quite a few strides with election reform and getting with regard to HAVA, the Help America Vote Act, with the BMD machines, ballot marking device machines, which you've all seen in polling places. These are voting machines that provide an independent and accessible vote for persons with disabilities. Before then, before the BMD machines, there were the lever machines, which disenfranchised voters with disabilities. If you have a visual disability, you really couldn't vote privately and independently. You need to bring somebody into the voting booth with you. So the ballot marking devices do provide that opportunity, to provide that civil right, that right to vote privately and independently, just as everyone else does. Polling site, we did a lot of work. I did a lot of work in Westchester in my prior position around polling site access. Many of Westchester County's polling sites were not accessible, in the mid-2000s, before the legislation was passed that all polling sites in New York State had to be accessible. So we did site surveys. I worked with colleagues and we surveyed every polling site in Westchester County for accessibility. There are barriers, locked doors, ramps, poll workers that weren't trained adequately on election law. We disseminated these findings, our surveys, to the Board of Elections and to the Westchester County Board of Elections, and we were pretty much ignored. So we worked with the local attorney and we filed a lawsuit, a federal lawsuit in 2004, and we got a consent decree in Westchester County that every polling site had to be made accessible. And we were, according to the Westchester County Board of Elections, was under the consent decree, had to work with us, had to work with the Independent Living Center at the time, the 2 independent living centers in Westchester, to bring all their sites into compliance. So that was a huge win. That was a lot of systems advocacy. That was a lot of volunteer work, reaching out to college students, community members to do site surveys with us and to really try to really get that moving forward. Education, there's a lot of issues right now in public education around, especially with COVID. We're seeing in Dutchess and across the state, everywhere, across the nation, actually, inaccessible platforms, virtual platforms that do not accommodate students with disabilities, autism in particular. There's a lot of regression now going on in our community with kids regarding students with disabilities, that because they've been, because of the virtual classroom instruction over the past year and a half, they've regressed. There's a lot of issues now with absenteeism, behavioral issues. It's a huge issue that our center is working on with regard to creating with webinars, working with our school administrators and creating. We just created a survey that's going out to parents. Working with Vassar College, again, coalition building, working with our local community members. We worked with some of the students there in the education department to put together a survey and a database to as a sharing forum for parents to issue their instances of complaints to schools and to speak in one voice around issues of students are disenfranchised. And that's an ongoing project that we're engaged in right now. Employment's a big one. Doug talked a lot, Anthony talked a lot about that. There's because of the perceptions that people with disabilities are not capable of gainful employment, there's a lot of discrimination around that. I talked about that in the last segment last week, and we showed a video around that. All the folks that were in that video were not able to find gainful employment because of that misperception, attitudinal discrimination. Segregated settings and sub-minimum wage. These are sheltered workshops where folks with intellectual and developmental disabilities are getting paid far less than they, under the minimum wage. They're doing piecemeal work. That has to stop. There's a lot of advocacy around that. Lack of accessible transportation. There's some lawsuits now being waged against Uber and Lyft. There are still buses and that are not fully accessible, trains, cabs. So that's an ongoing issue that we're working on. And so institutionalization and community-based living is with this webinar is the overarching issue of what we're talking about here. Doug's presentation on Olmsted, the right to community-based living, and institutionalization as an act of discrimination. All of these things are important with regard to that issue, right? I mean, affordable and accessible housing, as Anthony and Doug both mentioned, are huge barriers to community-based living. The lack of affordable housing, accessible housing, is what keeps most people, either sends them into an institution or keeps them there. So that, you know, we're working on that aggressively. A lot of testimonials I've done before, you know, Senate and on the federal and state levels to increase opportunities, increase construction of more accessible housing and affordable housing. That's ongoing. Transportation options, people that don't have transportation are isolated, and they're not able to really fully integrate into the communities. And we talked about that in the last, I talked about that in the last segment, to increase accessible opportunity or accessible transportation options for people with disabilities, employment, lack of employment, underemployment, keeps people from fully integrating in their communities, keeps them impoverished, unable to really exercise full choice. CDPEP, Consumer Directed Personal Assistance Program, is really a crucial program that provides community-based support to people to live in their own homes, giving them full direction in their care, to hire attendants and to direct those attendants to provide appropriate care. That is, again, a lot of you know, advocacy around CDPEP because of the reimbursement. Doug alluded to that or mentioned that in his segment. Reimbursement rate is really threatening that program. There's again a crisis with regard to a personal attendant care, wage parity for attendants, as a shortage of attendants. So folks with disabilities are just unable to really obtain the proper enough attendant care, and we're not able to really solicit or recruit personal care attendants because of the reimbursement rates and the lack of wage parity. Medicaid reform and long-term care is an ongoing advocacy issue for us. It's an agenda item that makes it every year on our legislative priority across the state priority agenda. There's so many issues around Medicaid reform, Medicaid cap, way assessments are done, reimbursement rates, you know, insurance company, you know, insurance policy parity. So that is an ongoing issue that we're addressing. And again, the fair pay for home care carrying majority that I mentioned, we've all talked about with regard to personal care attendants. And civil rights complaints. I did a lot of work with this, filing OCR complaints. You know, Olmsted, the Olmsted decision passed in 1990, guaranteeing folks with disabilities or people that they should be, you know, guaranteed the right to live in the most integrated settings. Nursing facilities are not those settings. Institutionalization is not, you know, an acceptable option for people who want to be fully engaged in their communities. So as a independent living network several years ago, and it's ongoing, but we really engaged in a very vigorous campaign to go into nursing facilities and inform the residents there about their rights, and we filed Office of Civil Rights complaints on their behalf against the state of New York. I personally filed 22 of those complaints. As a result of some of those complaints, we were able to transition some folks out. But again, and a lot of people a lot of those folks, when I did some presentations to them regarding their rights, were not even aware that they had the right to live outside the community. So education, extremely important. You know, community organizing is a very important aspect of systems advocacy. And I've done a lot of it. We've all done a lot of it. You know, I mentioned the Westchester Disability Advocacy Partnership earlier. That was a coalition that I formed in Westchester County. It was a very slow start. I had maybe a core group of maybe 10 people at the outset. At the end of maybe 8 or 9 years, we had about 50 or 60 people that were a member of that partnership. Cross disability, we outreach to all different advocacy organizations, not just IL, to try to get power in numbers, to create position papers, to come together and testify at public forums in Westchester County, to push resolutions around voting reform, transportation options, and healthcare. So that was a very important community organizing activity, and it's still alive, actually. It's still going on right now in Westchester. So that very effective in really driving issues forward and generating a lot of attention within the public sector. Creating a systems advocacy team of consumers, people with disabilities to participate in action alerts that I mentioned earlier, letter writing campaigns, providing public testimony, testimonials to public officials, and organizing in getting folks with disabilities to organize in their own communities around issues of impact. I've done a lot of work with local college students, recruiting local college students. The Board of Elections 2004 lawsuit that we waged against Westchester County Board of Elections in 2004 we were able to do that with the help of Iona students and some local colleges in the area to do surveys for us and write position papers. Timothy's Law campaign, I'm going to mention this, there's a lot of these, Kendra's Law, there's so many of them, but Timothy's Law, I think, was a very important one. That was a statewide effort where on one day we had a call to action where every county orchestrated, coordinated an action. Timothy's Law is about mental health parity. It's based on a Timothy who unfortunately committed suicide while institutionalized. He was he became a ward of the state because of the lack of healthcare parity as a Medicaid recipient. He was sent 200 miles from his home, I believe, and he hung himself while he was in that institution. His father created Timothy's Law, drove the Timothy's Law campaign to raise attention to this issue around mental health parity for Medicaid recipients. And so we actually, during the Timothy's Law campaign, that state call to action that one day, I think it was 2000, I don't remember the exact date now, 2006 maybe. We actually got Timothy's Law passed in New York State. It passed one house, it passed the Assembly, but not the Senate, as a result of the campaign and raising public awareness and getting a lot of media coverage. It did, we did drive that. We did raise enough awareness and public outrage around it that it moved the legislation forward. Project Access is a housing project that I engaged in Westchester County to create a registry rather of affordable and accessible residential housing units in Westchester County. We just did a survey. I got some community block grant funding through from White Plains to create a model, kind of a pilot program in White Plains, where we did a survey of all the apartment buildings in White Plains and rated them according to accessibility and affordability. And then we created a database and disseminated that over our website, and I outreached to local disability organizations to include it on their websites, and that provided a resource for people looking for accessible housing. And we got a lot of success with that. I think folks were able to find a lot of housing, and it also generates some media coverage about the need for affordable, accessible housing. And then partnerships we've done a lot of this, partnering with affordable housing developers to create set aside units of affordable housing. We have 3 or 4 housing service agreements with local developers that once these projects housing projects are developed, there are 12, there are set aside units for people with visual and physical disabilities. And we have, they're guaranteed to our consumers. So that's, and then just a quote from Judy Heumann, as had Doug mentioned, a real pioneer in the disability rights movement. System change takes time. Change never happens at the pace we think it should. It happens over years of people joining together strategizing, sharing, and pulling all the levers they possibly can. Gradually, excruciatingly slowly, things start to happen, and then suddenly, seemingly out of the blue, something will tip. And I've seen that in my career. I mean, there are tipping points there, I wish there were more, but we have had several victories, but it does take a lot of community organizing, a lot of vigilance, and, a lot of coordination. And so, if anyone wants to get involved, we're forming a task force. I'm forming a task force right now with some residents in Rhinebeck around Title II, Title III compliance, but we're working across Dutchess County. If you have any issues that you'd like to talk about, if you'd like to join our task force, if you'd like more information, anything I've mentioned here today, please contact me 845-452-3913, extension 105. And my email address is l.tarricone, TARRICONE, @seconicresources.org, all one word. And our website is there, www.
You're muted, Lisa.
Okay, there we go. Sorry. Okay, thank you. Did I just unmute myself, I hope?
Yep, you're unmuted now.
Okay, thank you. I'm trying to get rid of the slide here, stuff to share. Okay, thank you.
Okay. All right, thank you for that, Lisa. We appreciate it. So right now, according to my time, we have about 7 minutes until we have to close. So at this time, in 7 minutes, we are asking, this is where we go right into our Q&A. So if you have any questions or responses to our speakers, you can put it in chat and then we can read it out to the speakers. Doug, you have put something up there right now, but since you're already a speaker, do you want to just go ahead and speak on what you put in the chat?
Oh, there was a comment about housing and HUD. HUD provides a lot of funding and financing and develops housing, and they provide Section 8 certificates. That's the federal branch of government that is known as the Housing Authority, right? Housing and Urban Development is what HUD stands for. But there's also Homes and Community Renewal, HCR, in New York State that appropriates millions of dollars every year. And I think, one of the things that we've been trying to get them to do is to change their policy a little bit, because they tend to target certain disability groups, but not others. And in particular, older adults and people with significant physical disabilities are often not targeted for accessible housing and affordable housing, and housing subsidies, which are critically important. And Lisa mentioned before that there are some programs that help to keep people out of nursing homes, like the Nursing Home Transition and Diversion Waiver Program. That has a housing subsidy that goes with it, but there's not enough of them. I mean, it's very, very underfunded, significantly underfunded. But we're just trying to get HCR to recognize people, older adults and people with significant physical disabilities as a part of their vision and their plan for accessible housing. And there's a lot of laws on the books in New York State that are very strict about construction, whether it's major renovation or new construction, that require housing to be fully accessible, but there's limited oversight. So that's really where the independent living centers come in. It's not really, it shouldn't be our responsibility solely, obviously. But independent living centers were designed to be facilitators of the disability rights movement, to take the reins, so to speak, and take it to the next level, using things like the ADA, using Olmstead. But housing is a huge issue. Housing, home care supports, employment, as Anthony talked about. The unemployment rate amongst people with disabilities is staggering. 3 out of 4 people with disabilities, working age people with disabilities, are unemployed. And that's horrific to think about. So what that says is that the majority of people with disabilities are living at or below the poverty level. And that's got to change. So that's why through the Olmstead Council at New York State, we have a committee that is focused on employment services, for example. But we have a lot of work to do. We've come a long way. And you can't just, it's never one and done. You can't just pass a law and say, "Oh, we're good. We got the ADA. We can, we can rest now." We, as people with disabilities, we don't rest. We don't rest. We're the eyes and the ears of the disability community. We're constantly addressing emerging concerns on a regular basis. As Lisa pointed out, 22 filings that she's done in her time. And other independent living centers have done a lot of filings for the Department of Justice or the EEOC on behalf of people with disabilities who've been discriminated against. There are laws out there, but we need enforcement mechanisms.
Thank you for that, Doug. So we have 3 minutes. So I didn't see nothing in the chat, but I can ask, all of you, what is it that everyone can do to get behind this? Alisa, 22, it's just a lot. But what I'm not hearing is, where are the people who standing behind this, right? How can people get behind this to make, this a national movement? What could people do to help that process and get behind, this fight?
Good question.
Yeah, I think that it starts at the community level. I mean, ADAPT started fairly small. Now they've got 30 chapters across the country. I think that the community organizing that I talked about and that we've all discussed is getting folks with disabilities to organize, raising issue, the Timothy's Law campaign. The reason that got, I think, just in Westchester, when we had speakers at that forum to talk about what goes on in institutional settings, we had folks during that forum handing out pamphlets of here's what you can do about this. If you're outraged, call your legislator, and that pushed that legislation, and it pushes it's ongoing. I think you need to be persistent at the community level, at the state level, at the federal level, and it's a burgeoning movement. I mean, the IL movement is very robust right now. So I think it's everything we're doing now, and to just keep doing it.
Absolutely. Thank you. We got 1 minute. I want to get this question that Christine Jones sent in. Do you have agencies or contractors who are looking for property to build accessible housing? Have no idea what affordable really is. Where is the stall?
I think there are developers out there and organizations that are always looking for accessible or opportunities to build accessible and affordable housing. So they're looking for properties and the properties have to have municipal services. You've got to have water and sewer in particular. And you've got to have, a community that's receptive. You talk about strategic partnerships, Tyrone. One of the partners obviously is municipalities, but everybody can be a stakeholder in supporting the disability rights movement. We're all somehow either directly or indirectly affected by disability, whether it's a family member, a friend, a neighbor, or somebody that we know. And it's an important part of human rights, and which is why we're here today. And we all have to get behind human rights and recognize all marginalized folks as needing that support. I mean, intersectionality is huge. We come together, we're powerful. We're no longer the minority, right? So, yeah.
All right. So I want to thank you all. This concludes our webinar of doing more than nothing. I want to thank my colleagues, my partners in the human rights departments, Orange County, Dutchess County. We want to thank our speakers, Lisa, Doug, and Anthony. Thank you guys so much. This was powerful. This was really powerful. And I hope that all of the audience, you go out and you share this and we promote to let's get behind this. I think it's very much needed, and let's do all we can to make sure that we in support of what's happening here. I do believe this will be recorded. This recorded, you will have access to it. Jen, I don't know if you want to touch on that real quick. I think it's going on Dutchess County site.
It will be both in the Dutchess County and also the Orange County Human Rights Commission's webpage.
Awesome. So if you need to get these recordings of this webinar today, please look out for that. We want to thank you all. Please look out for the next webinars that's coming out, and thank you for supporting us. So on behalf of all of us, thank you so much, and have a good one.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.